June 1970, Conference Room 3B, Motown Records, Detroit. The mahogany table reflected the fluorescent lights above as Marvin Gaye sat across from Berry Gordy, the man who had discovered him, shaped him, and made him a star. Between them lay a single acetate disc containing 8 minutes and 45 seconds of music that would either revolutionize soul or destroy Marvin's career. Berry had just finished listening to What's Going On for the first time. His face was stone. His fingers drummed the table in that familiar rhythm Marvin knew meant trouble. When Berry finally spoke, his voice was calm but final. "We don't release protest music, Marvin. This isn't what people want from you." In that moment, Marvin felt something inside him break. Not his heart, not his spirit, something deeper, his faith in the very foundation of his professional life. He would spend the next 2 years proving Berry wrong, but the cost would be higher than either man could have imagined. To understand why Berry Gordy's rejection of What's Going On devastated Marvin so completely, you need to understand what Motown had meant to him. It wasn't just a record label. It was family. It was home. It was the place where a preacher's son from Washington, D.C. had been transformed into the Prince of Soul. Berry Gordy hadn't just signed Marvin to a contract. He had adopted him into a musical dynasty that promised success, security, and artistic fulfillment. For 11 years, Marvin had been the perfect Motown artist. He recorded the songs they gave him. He performed where they booked him. He wore the suits they chose. He smiled when they told him to smile. And in return, he had been rewarded with fame, fortune, and the adoration of millions. The system worked until the day it didn't. The song that would tear apart this perfect arrangement had been born from a place of genuine anguish. Marvin's close friend, Ronaldo Obi Benson from the Four Tops, had witnessed police brutality at an anti-war demonstration in Berkeley and came to Marvin with a song idea about the pain and confusion consuming America. The lyrics spoke of mothers crying, fathers dying, and a world where hatred seemed to be winning over love. When Marvin first heard the melody, something clicked. This wasn't just another song. This was a chance to say something that mattered, to use his voice for more than romance and seduction, to address the chaos he saw everywhere around him. But as Marvin developed What's Going On in his home studio, adding layers of saxophone, strings, and his own multi-track vocals, he knew he was crossing a line. Motown had built its empire on escapism. Their artists sang about love, heartbreak, and dancing. They created a fantasy where young people could forget about Vietnam, civil rights, and the violence tearing the country apart. Motown was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be fun. And here was Marvin, their biggest romantic star, creating something that forced listeners to confront uncomfortable truths. The recording sessions for What's Going On took place in Studio A at Hitsville, USA, the same room where Marvin had recorded How Sweet It Is and I Heard It Through the Grapevine. But the atmosphere was different now. Instead of the usual party-like energy that characterized Motown sessions, there was a reverent quiet. The musicians understood they were creating something special, something that might change everything. Marvin conducted the session like a man possessed, layering vocal after vocal, adjusting arrangements, pushing everyone toward a perfection that existed only in his mind. When the final mix was complete, Marvin sat alone in the control booth and listened to what he had created. He knew it was the best thing he had ever recorded. He also knew it might be the last thing Motown would ever let him release. The meeting with Berry Gordy had been arranged through normal channels. Marvin requested time to play his new recording for the boss. Berry, always interested in what his top artists were creating, agreed to listen. But as the opening saxophone melody filled the conference room and Marvin's voice began its plea for understanding and peace, Berry's expression changed. This wasn't the Marvin Gaye he knew. This wasn't the artist who had built his career on smooth romantic ballads. This was someone else entirely, someone who was asking difficult questions instead of providing easy answers. When the song ended, the silence in the room felt infinite. Berry rewound the acetate and listened again, hoping he had missed something, hoping there was a way to make this work within Motown's carefully constructed image. But there wasn't. What's Going On was everything Motown was not. It was political. It was confrontational. It was the kind of music that made people think instead of dance, and that made it dangerous. The kids don't want to hear this, Berry said, his voice carrying the weight of 11 years of proven success. They want to feel good. They want to escape. This makes them feel bad about things they can't control. Marvin tried to explain. He spoke about the letters he received from soldiers in Vietnam, about the pain in his younger brother Frankie's eyes when he returned from the war, about the responsibility he felt to use his platform for something meaningful. But Berry had heard enough. The decision was final. What's Going On would not be released. Walking out of that conference room, Marvin felt something he had never experienced in his professional life. Rejection. Not from the public, not from critics, but from the people he trusted most, the people who were supposed to understand him. Berry Gordy and the Motown executives hadn't just rejected his song. They had rejected his growth as an artist and as a human being. They wanted him to remain frozen in time, forever the charming romantic crooner, never allowed to evolve or address the world around him. That night, Marvin sat in his house on Outer Drive in Detroit, staring at the wall where his gold records hung. Each one represented a moment of triumph, proof that he had made music that mattered to people. But suddenly, they felt like chains, evidence of a contract he had signed without reading the fine print. He was Motown's property, and they had decided what he could and could not say to the world. The realization settled over him like a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. The next morning, Marvin made a decision that shocked everyone at Motown. He called his manager and delivered a simple message. He would not record another note until Berry Gordy agreed to release What's Going On. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of principle that would define the rest of his career. Marvin Gaye was declaring war on the system that had created him. The first few weeks of Marvin's boycott were met with bemusement at Motown. Berry Gordy and the other executives assumed this was just artistic temperament, a creative tantrum that would blow over once Marvin realized the financial cost of his stubbornness. They had dealt with difficult artists before. Diana Ross had her moments. Stevie Wonder pushed boundaries. But everyone eventually came back to the fold because the alternative, life outside the Motown family, was unthinkable. But Marvin didn't come back. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Studio time reserved for Marvin went unused. Sessions were canceled. Other artists asked where he was, and nobody had a good answer. The Prince of Soul had simply vanished from the building that had been his second home for over a decade. At his house, Marvin tried to maintain a normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. He would wake up and dress for the studio, then remember he wasn't going. He would write songs, beautiful melodies and lyrics that poured out of him, but there was no point in recording them. They would just sit in his head, unheard by anyone but him. Friends called, asking when he was going back to work. Family members worried about his mental state, but Marvin remained resolute. What's Going On represented everything he wanted to say about the world. If Motown wouldn't let him say it, then he would say nothing at all. The financial pressure began immediately. Marvin's contract guaranteed him income only when he was actively recording and touring. By refusing to work, he was essentially volunteering for poverty. Bills piled up. His wife Anna, Berry Gordy's sister, found herself caught between her husband's principles and her family's business interests. The stress began to fracture their marriage in ways that would never fully heal. But Marvin held firm. Some things, he told himself, were more important than money. Berry Gordy, meanwhile, was dealing with his own pressures. Motown was in the middle of transitioning from Detroit to Los Angeles, a move that required enormous financial resources and careful management of the label's roster. Having his biggest male artist on strike was not just an inconvenience, it was a threat to the entire operation. Distributors were asking questions. Radio stations wanted new Marvin Gaye material. The longer the standoff continued, the more it cost everyone involved. But Berry also understood that backing down would set a dangerous precedent. If Marvin could dictate his own material, other artists might demand the same freedom. The careful control that had made Motown successful could unravel. Artists might start creating music based on their personal visions, rather than market research and proven formulas. It was a risk Berry wasn't willing to take. 6 months into the boycott, something unexpected happened. Marvin's absence became a story. Music journalists began asking questions about why Motown's biggest star had stopped recording. Rumors circulated about a secret album, about disputes with management, about Marvin's mental health. The mystery only increased public interest in whatever he would release next. Berry Gordy realized that Marvin's silence had inadvertently created the kind of anticipation that money couldn't buy. But Marvin was paying a price that went beyond finances. The creative energy that had always defined him was being channeled inward, creating a pressure that had nowhere to go. He would wake up with melodies in his head, beautiful musical ideas that demanded to be recorded. But his principles wouldn't allow him to enter a studio. The songs remained trapped inside him, building up like water behind a dam. He began to understand what it meant to be an artist without the ability to create art. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Marvin had always been surrounded by musicians, producers, and collaborators. The studio was where he felt most alive, most himself. Now his days were empty, filled only with his own thoughts and the growing certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. But admitting that mistake would mean abandoning the song that had started it all. And What's Going On remained the thing he was most proud of creating. As 1970 turned into 1971, both sides began to show signs of strain. Marvin had lost weight and developed a nervous habit of pacing his house for hours. His conversations became obsessed with proving his point, with justifying a decision that was costing him everything he had worked for. Berry Gordy, meanwhile, was fielding questions from investors and board members about when Motown's most reliable hitmaker would return to productivity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Harry Balk, a Motown sales executive, had been getting requests from DJs who had somehow heard bootleg copies of What's Going On. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People weren't just listening to the song. They were talking about it, requesting it, playing it repeatedly. The market research that Berry had always relied on was telling a different story than his instincts. In January 1971, Berry Gordy made a decision that felt like swallowing broken glass. He called Marvin and offered a compromise. Motown would release What's Going On as a single, but only as an experiment. If it failed, Marvin would return to recording the romantic material that had made him famous. If it succeeded, they would discuss giving him more creative freedom. The call lasted less than 10 minutes, but it represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power at Motown. For the first time in the label's history, an artist had successfully challenged Berry Gordy's artistic judgment and won. But victory came with a bitter aftertaste. The trust between Marvin and the Motown organization had been irreparably damaged. They would work together again, but they would never be family again. What's Going On was released on January 20th, 1971, almost exactly 7 months after Marvin had first played it for Berry Gordy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The song shot to #2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became Motown's fastest-selling single ever. Critics praised it as revolutionary. Other artists began creating their own socially conscious material. The protest music that Berry had declared commercially unviable became the sound of a generation. But for Marvin, success felt hollow. He had won the battle but lost something precious in the process. The innocence of his relationship with Motown was gone forever. Every future creative decision would be a negotiation, a potential conflict. The simple joy of walking into Hitsville, USA, and creating music with people who understood him had been replaced by wariness and calculation. Recording the full What's Going On album later that year, Marvin found himself working in an atmosphere of careful politeness. The musicians and producers were respectful but distant. Everyone knew about the boycott, about the power struggle that had nearly destroyed careers on both sides. The easy camaraderie that had defined Motown's golden age was gone, replaced by professional efficiency that felt cold and mechanical. The album became Marvin's masterpiece, a coherent statement about love, war, environment, and spirituality that influenced countless artists and established him as a serious social commentator. But every note was tinged with the knowledge of what it had cost to create it. Marvin had gotten his artistic freedom, but freedom turned out to be lonelier than he had expected. In the years that followed, Marvin would create more groundbreaking music. Let's Get It On pushed boundaries in different ways. I Want You explored darker territories of desire, but he never again felt the pure excitement of being part of a musical family. The relationship with Berry Gordy remained professional, but never warm. Other artists at Motown viewed Marvin with a mixture of respect and caution, knowing he had proven it was possible to challenge the system, but unsure of whether they were brave enough to try. The boycott had lasted 246 days, not quite 8 months. But in that time, Marvin had aged years. The experience taught him that artistic integrity came with a price, and that price was paid not just in money, but in relationships, security, and peace of mind. He had won the right to make the music he believed in, but he had lost the simple pleasure of making music with people he loved. When Marvin died in 1984, shot by his own father, many people remembered him as the artist who had successfully challenged the music industry establishment. But those who knew him best understood that the real tragedy wasn't just his violent death. It was that the man who had fought so hard for the right to express himself had spent his final years feeling increasingly isolated and misunderstood. The victory over What's Going On had given him artistic credibility, but had also marked the beginning of his emotional exile from the world he had once called home. Today, What's Going On is considered one of the greatest songs ever recorded, a timeless meditation on social justice and human understanding. But it remains also a monument to the cost of artistic integrity, a reminder that sometimes getting what you fight for can be its own form of loss. Marvin had wanted the freedom to make meaningful music. He got that freedom, but he also learned that freedom could be the loneliest place in the world.